We want to continue this learning community by talking about Anabaptism as a way to address the post-Christendom world that is emerging. And so, Stuart and Juliet, take it away.
Thank you very much. Yes, Stuart's going to kickstart our discussions and our conversations this afternoon. But before he does that, just two more plugs while we're in the business of plugging books. We have just a few copies here of a booklet that Stuart and I wrote together called Church Planting in the Inner City, the Urban Expression Story. They're available on the table over there. If we run out, then they are available online somewhere. You just need to search for the Grove booklet. And also, this is the only copy we have of a booklet which contains prayers which have been developed by people in urban expression around our core values. A little bit later on this afternoon, I'm going to be sharing a bit more about urban expression, but we are based around a core set of values, and these prayer resources have been developed out of those values. Feel free to have a look at it. If any of you wants to buy it, there is only one copy, but it's also available online to download as a PDF, so that might be the easiest way to get hold of it. And what I'll do is I'll write down the address where you can find it, and I'll leave it on the table next to this in case you're interested in doing that. So Stuart's going to start us off this afternoon as we consider a little bit about Anabaptism. Is it a movement whose time has come again? A movement which can move out of the depths of history and find a new place of belonging in a post-Christendom environment. Stuart, would you like to start us off?
Okay, Juliet, given what you just said, does that mean you've got the PowerPoint above your head?
Oh, yeah, where's that gone?
Oh, good.
I haven't found it yet. Yeah, I'll try and get it onto the screen.
That's fine, I'll get going anyway.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you've had a good lunch. I had quite a nice supper. And I've got a goblet of red wine beside me, so I'm sure that will help me to speak more clearly through this afternoon's session. My apologies also for not being present in the flesh. I did try very hard to get to First President and Riverside, but Department of Homeland Security decided I was too much of a security risk and decided they wouldn't let me in, so my apologies for that. I spent much of the last couple of weeks in Canada working with a couple of Mennonite conferences in particular over in the East and then in British Columbia. And much of the time was talking with them about the surprising way in which the Naked Anabaptist book has sold in North America. And I'm aware that it's being used by a variety of congregations and by some book clubs and by individuals. And I've been really quite taken aback by the level of interest in it written in North American context primarily. I'm delighted that it's been useful. I'm glad that people are finding it stimulating. But primarily it was written as a way of trying to introduce British Christians to the Anabaptist tradition and to try to explain why Anabaptism seems to be making a lot of sense to people in post-Christendom Europe. I just want to reflect a little bit with you on the growing interest in Anabaptism and some of the responses I've had to the book before we go into some of the connections between what we're looking at this morning and how Anabaptism might relate to that. Something very strange seems to be happening in a variety of nations which have little or no historic Anabaptist presence. In a variety of places, Christians from many other traditions, Protestant and Catholic, conservative and liberal, evangelical, charismatic, you name it, right across the denominational spectrum, are beginning to turn to Anabaptism to find inspiration and resources for a post-Christendom world. Some are wholeheartedly embracing Anabaptism and would now describe themselves as Anabaptist as the first way of describing themselves. They might belong to a different denomination still, but Anabaptist would be their chosen designation. and I would certainly put myself in that category. For the last 25 years, I have happily described myself first and foremost as an Anabaptist Christian. Others we sometimes refer to as hyphenated Anabaptists, by which we mean people for whom the Anabaptist tradition has become increasingly significant, but they are looking to combine Anabaptist insights with their own tradition. So we would have Methodist Anabaptists and Anglican Anabaptists and Pentecostal Anabaptists and so on. But whether it's Anabaptists or hyphenated Anabaptists, there seems to be a burgeoning interest in the Anabaptist tradition. So I bring you greetings from the Anabaptist network in the UK, but there are also either established or emerging networks in a variety of other places like Australia and New Zealand, South Africa, Korea, China, and even in Scandinavia. More recently, a new Anabaptist network has begun there. And these are all nations with little or no historic Anabaptist presence. Anabaptists really never got established in England. In 1575, a group of refugees from Flanders tried to find a place of refuge in England, but were discovered, betrayed to the authorities, imprisoned, interrogated. 2 were eventually executed, the rest were deported back to Europe. And England said very firmly no to Anabaptism towards the end of the 16th century. Really since then, the Anabaptist presence has been minimal or non-existent, until about 50 years ago, when through the work of the London Mennonite Centre, the Anabaptist story began to be told again in the UK, and people gradually began stumbling across this tradition that had been absent for so long. I'm conscious also that in the US and Canada, young Christians in particular, from outside historic Anabaptist denominations, have been drawn to Anabaptism. Quite a number of the emails I've had from people who've read the Naked Anabaptist have indicated that they're not from Mennonite or Church of the Brethren backgrounds, but have been drawn to Anabaptism, and the book has helped them to understand why. I've also had emails from either ex-Mennonites or young Mennonites who have found the book helpful in enabling them to rediscover and reevaluate their own tradition, somehow taking it out of the cultural clothing of their own historic denomination and helping to see the essence of Anabaptism more clearly. That was certainly the intention when we chose the title. We wanted to present Anabaptism in a fairly simple and straightforward way, unvarnished, unadorned, recognising its weaknesses as well as its strengths, but suggesting that it's got a huge amount to offer into our current situation. Another book that I've read while I've been in Canada is a book that some of you may be familiar with already, Joanna Schacht's book, Widening the Circle. I don't know whether it's on the bookstall. If it is, no doubt Jeff will plug it at some point and try and sell it to you at an exorbitant price. But the book contains a whole set of stories of people either from within the Anabaptist tradition or from outside who have been exploring what radical discipleship means in a changing culture and have found the Anabaptist tradition enlivening and enlightening. It also talks a bit about some of the struggles some of them have had with more traditional Mennonite culture. Somehow Anabaptist values and Mennonite culture don't always seem to sit comfortably together. But there is a growing list of church leaders from a variety of places who are affirming the significance of the Anabaptist tradition. And that's why I think many of us are beginning to ask the question, is the Anabaptist tradition one whose time has come? Are the reasons why Anabaptism is seeming to make an awful lot of sense in a post-Christendom world? The book has recently been translated into Spanish, and translations are underway into French, Swedish, Korean, Japanese, I think also just in Hindi. So in a variety of places, most with very, very little or no Anabaptist tradition, something of the Anabaptist story is beginning to resonate with people. As I mentioned, the book was written primarily for those in Britain who are discovering the Anabaptist tradition, and what we've tried to do is to set out fairly clearly what we feel is at the heart of the Anabaptist tradition. And you should have somewhere in your notes the 7 core convictions of the Anabaptist network. And we want to work with you a little bit on those this afternoon to ask what these mean in practice how do we understand them in our context, and how might they be useful for Christians in a variety of places and settings. Just a couple of things to say about the core convictions, which are really at the heart of the Naked Anabaptist book. First of all, let's be very clear that these are not a creed, but a set of convictions. Anabaptists have been wary of fixed creeds. I think for two reasons. First of all, because a fixed creed suggests that we now know everything there is to know and there's no further exploration. That doesn't fit very well with this idea of an ongoing journey. And secondly, the creeds have often been used to exclude or punish people. And again, Anabaptists have suffered at the hands of creeds, and so I think they're wary of them. But there have been quite a number of Anabaptist confessions through the centuries, and it's really a confession that we have here. A set of convictions, a set of beliefs and commitments that flow out of those beliefs. But they are not fixed, they're not settled, and this I think is the third version that we have worked on. The temptation we now have, since it's in book form, is to refuse to revise them any further. I think it's a mistake, and I hope that within the next 2 or 3 years we will revise them again and hopefully develop and improve them. One of the things that might possibly come out of our conversation today are some suggestions as to ways in which they could be improved. Something that came out of a previous discussion a few months ago in New Zealand was the concern that these look a bit over-ethical. There isn't a huge amount here about grace or the work of the Spirit. It's very much discipleship orientated, very much to do with ethical behaviour, that kind of thing. Well, I guess that is typically Anabaptist in some ways, but I think that's a valid concern, and one of the questions that we need to consider is whether we need to say a bit more about the work of grace and disciples, about the work of the Spirit. So do feel free to engage critically with these. We're not precious about them, and they matter to us. They're the centre of gravity around which we gather. We work quite hard on them, but we certainly don't think they're complete or final, and we certainly welcome some further input on those. I think the other thing to say about them is that they are aspirations rather than achievements. And we thought it was important, as we set down some of our beliefs, to talk also about some of the commitments that flow out of those. And so you'll see that each of the 7 core convictions commits us to certain practices or emphases. And we take those seriously. But these are not records of achievements, they're aspirations. And it's important that we set them in their context. So let me just do one more thing before suggesting some discussion that we might have. If you have read The Naked Anabaptist, you will already have come across what I'm about to share with you. If you haven't, you may find this either intriguing or worrying, I'm not sure which. But I want to read you the statements of 3 contemporary North American church leaders who have encountered the Anabaptist tradition and have found it challenging and life-giving. And I read these deliberately because I think it's helpful for us who are part of the Anabaptist tradition, whether historic Anabaptist denominations or neo-Anabaptists like myself. It's helpful for us to understand what it is that people see in this tradition. So let me read you, first of all, something that Brian McLaren said, actually to a Mennonite conference a little while ago. If you're not familiar with Brian McLaren, he is perhaps one of the best-known figures in the American emergent church movement. And he said this: "We need a form of Christian faith that is holistic, integral and balanced, that speaks of God's grace to individuals and to societies and the planet as a whole. We so desperately need, as we move into this emerging culture, to learn to live a life of Christ instead of just going to church. Anabaptists know more about this than the rest of us, and you, the Anabaptists, need to let your knowledge rub off on others." The second statement is from Tom Sine. Tom Sine is a futurologist and a Christian who's thought a lot about the way in which culture is changing. He's part of a group called Mustard Seed Associates, and he has been interested in Anabaptism for quite some time. And this is what he has written fairly recently. God is doing something new through a new generation that has a distinctly Anabaptist accent in these uncertain times. These young initiators are creating new ways to make a difference in both the world and the church, inviting all of us to embrace a more radical, whole-life faith and to create churches that are more outwardly focused in mission. These new Anabaptist conspirators have the possibility of calling growing numbers of young people from outside the Anabaptist tradition to join a more biblically radical approach to life, faith, and witness for peace, justice, and creation care. And then thirdly, Greg Boyd, the author of The Myth of a Christian Nation, who may be quite well known to many of you. And he writes in even more startling terms. There is a beautiful and powerful grassroots kingdom movement arising all over the globe. Millions of people are abandoning the Christendom paradigm of the traditional Christian faith in order to become more authentic followers of Jesus. You know, again, that term, followers of Jesus, that we looked at earlier. What many who are being caught up in this movement lack is a sense of tribal identity and historical rooting. Many, therefore, are looking for a tradition they can align with. The only tradition that embodies what this rising breed of kingdom radicals is looking for is the Anabaptist tradition. This is the only tradition that consistently refused political power and violence. This is the only tradition that made humble, self-sacrificial love the centerpiece of what it means to follow Jesus. It's the only tradition that isn't soaked in blood, and the only tradition that looks remotely like Jesus. Well, I don't know what you as historic Anabaptists make of those sorts of commendations. As I've talked to a number of, particularly Mennonite communities, the reaction seems to be a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Surely not our tradition. Why are they saying all these nice things about our tradition? Seems to be an inability to receive this as the kind of commendation it is. And I wondered why Mennonites in particular found it so difficult to receive this kind of praise. And I suspect it's, at least in part, something to do with the typical Anabaptist spirituality of humility. Surely we're not as good as this. Surely our tradition has lots of warts and weaknesses and problems. Surely they've misunderstood us. They can't be saying all these nice things about us. But maybe also it's because many in the traditional Anabaptist denominations have lost touch with their radical roots and are no longer captivated by the Anabaptist vision in the way that some of us who have come to it more lately now are. My hope, I guess, is that the Naked Anabaptist will be a wake-up call for the historic Anabaptist denominations who perhaps lost touch with their roots, but it will provide a new sense of perspective and hope that this tradition, which has been very much a marginal tradition, could actually be finding a place and a role and a vocation in a changing context. One other thing I want to say before suggesting we have some conversation is nothing at all in what I'm saying or in the book is meant to suggest that the Anabaptist tradition is perfect or that it is everything we need. We will need the resources of many traditions as we journey into post-Christendom. The last chapter of the book is very clear that there are significant weaknesses in the Anabaptist tradition. And in fact, the other reason for choosing the title The Naked Anabaptist is to say, well, actually, we need to be vulnerable. We need to recognise that there are warts, there are blemishes. We do not represent a kind of perfect tradition. There are real strengths and real values within the Anabaptist tradition, which I think are going to be crucial for our future. But it is one of a number of traditions, and we will need the compensating strengths of other traditions if we're to move forward with confidence into a changing world. So that's the introduction. You have in front of you the 7 core convictions, and it'd be good to do a little bit of work on that. But one question that I would pose to you, first of all, maybe something to think about in small groups, if that seems appropriate. Let me take you back to the other notes that you have, these 7 transitions from Christendom to post-Christendom. I don't know whether you have these back-to-back or whether you can put them alongside each other. But I want to ask you to set alongside each other the core convictions and the transitions from Christendom to post-Christendom. And to ask the question, what is it about the Anabaptist tradition, the Anabaptist vision, that seems to resonate with people today in post-Christendom? My conviction is that it's because of post-Christendom that Anabaptism is making sense to people. But there are certain things about these transitions that mean that the Anabaptist tradition is something particularly helpful to offer to us. But before I make any comments on that, I'd be interested to ask you, do you see these? Do you see ways in which there are connections between the Anabaptist tradition, either as you know it from your own denomination or from these four convictions, ways in which they relate to the transitions that we're currently experiencing? So let me hand back to Juliet to take over and to guide any discussion.
Okay. Well, why don't we do that? Let's, just for 10 minutes or so, let's turn around into small groups and ask that question, make some comparisons between the two lists in front of you, and ask what is it about Anabaptist movement that might relate to a post-Christendom context. And I'm hoping that the guys who are online got access to those documents as well. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so if you guys could maybe do the same, have a look at those lists, and then we'll get a little bit of feedback, and then hand back to Stuart for some more insight. Okay? Okay, friends, let's turn around and get back together again. I'm conscious that as the day goes on, we're probably not going to give you all the answers. In fact, you're probably going to leave today with more questions than answers. And even in this last discussion time, perhaps you've thought of some more questions that you'd like to pose. We will have an opportunity a little bit later to come back to those. But I wonder whether, just for now, whether any of you would like to make any comments about how the Anabaptist network core convictions could relate to a post-Christendom context. So statements of how they might relate rather than questions which have come out of your conversations, of which I'm sure there are many. Anyone want to make any comments? Do you see any natural connections between these core convictions and living in a post-Christendom environment? Any comments? You can come to the microphone if you want to make a couple of comments, or I can come over to this side of the room. Any observations? Or were you talking about something completely different, weren't you? I think you were.
I have a question for Stuart. Do I have to stand or can I sit down? Oh, I can't answer a question.
I'm sorry. Any observations? Okay.
Our group touched on many points as we went through the two sheets. The Anabaptists have always been a little bit on the margins. We've been a minority. As I shared here, part of what drew me to this belief was the idea of being a sojourner to begin with. I rebelled against the other. So with many different strains of Anabaptism seem to resonate.
So that aspect of being a marginal people, being a sojourner anyway, that connects anyway. Anyone else? Observation? Okay. They've gone shy on us, Stuart, for this bit, so I'm going to hand back to you. Stuart, what are the connections that you make between the core convictions and what it means to be in a post-Christendom environment?
Didn't quite catch everything you said just now. I caught the second half of it, but if I heard correctly, the connection was being made between the Anabaptist vision and issues such as marginality and sojourning and so on. And that's certainly one of the key connections I would make. As I look down this list of transitions into post-Christendom, marginality, minority, sojourning, no privileges, not being in control, really that's a way of describing the history of the Anabaptist movement in most places for the last 500 years. This is a minority tradition. It has been on the margins. It has not been in a position to control society. There were, of course, one or two incidents, such as in Munster in the 1530s, where there was an attempt to take control and things went badly wrong. But generally, Anabaptists have neither been in a position to control society nor have really wanted to. It's not been a tradition which has had privileges. So it does seem to me that of all the Christian traditions, the Anabaptist tradition should be the least fazed or worried by the realities of post-Christendom. In some ways, it's simply the rest of Western Christianity catching up with where the Anabaptists have been for the last 500 years. I think the second thing is, 500 years ago nearly, the Anabaptists responded to the realities of medieval Christendom by saying, this is not a good idea. Christendom is not what we think it is. Europe is not as Christian as we claim it to be, which is why they were such passionate evangelists. They were unconvinced that the partnership between church and state that was at the heart of Christendom society was good for either the church or the state. They believed that it was much better for the church to be free to be the church and the state to be free to be the state. And the constant reinforcement of interference with one another wasn't helpful. So in lots of ways, it seems to me, the Anabaptist tradition has grappled with the problems of Christendom much, much sooner than most other traditions. And because of that, really shouldn't be too bothered by some of the changes that are taking place. The reality, however, is in many historic Anabaptist congregations, there is quite a bit of concern about the emergence of post-Christendom. And that may be because of the sense of loss of vision. Perhaps some congregations have simply forgotten that their foremothers and forefathers didn't think Christendom was a good idea. Maybe we've got used to sheltering under the wing of a Christian society and not quite sure what to do if it's no longer there. Maybe it's because there has been such an accommodation with wealth and social norms that actually it's going to be quite a threat no longer to be part of that whole construct, but to be a pioneering marginal people once again. But I still think, in spite of some of the difficulties that historic Anabaptist congregations sometimes have with this, that actually the Anabaptist tradition is in a better place than most others to grapple with these new realities, because the mainline traditions have really been developed and sustained in the Christendom era. They took their bearings from Christendom. They are structured in the light of Christendom. And my experience of working with many different denominations is that many of them are really struggling to come to terms with what it means to be entering into post-Christendom. The whole basis on which they've operated, the assumptions, the expectations, the sense of their role in society, everything is now under threat. And they're really struggling to adapt to this changing culture. So I think if the Anabaptist congregations are struggling a bit with that, actually many other denominations and their churches are struggling much more. So I do think that the Anabaptist vision, the Anabaptist tradition, these core convictions have quite a lot to offer. But in order to be able to offer them with a degree of confidence, we need to know them and inhabit them and work them out ourselves. And I guess that's my hope as we continue through this session and continue to reflect on these things. So we'll be able to explore some of the ways in which the core convictions might actually energize and guide us as we journey on into post-Christendom. Juliet, I'm happy to stop and take one or two questions if there are some around. I think after that what we could do is to look at some examples from the core convictions, just to work them out, flesh them out a bit. But I'm happy to pause for some questions, or you may have some comments as well.
No, that's fine. So let's take a few questions, and then what I'm hoping to do is to just share with you a little bit more of the urban expression story as an agency that's kind of not so much been built on Anabaptist values, but I think discovered that its values are Anabaptist, and then increased our relationship with other Anabaptist agencies to learn more about what that means. So let's come back to some of those questions, and then you did have a question. I'll come back to you now, and I know that there are a few online as well that it would be good to hear. So what is your question, Terry?
For Stuart, I'm wondering how you would see the Anabaptist movement as affecting, impacting the decline of the Christian era. As you mentioned earlier, the Renaissance seemed to be an important point in that decline that we are trying to cope with. And I'm wondering if secularism isn't a natural result, and if secularism hasn't grown out of the Renaissance movement, and in what sense do we see the Anabaptist movement as impacting that? If I could just use a couple of books to illustrate my point. Here in the U.S., we've got a book by Marcus Borg, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. Interesting that he doesn't believe that Jesus was God incarnate, yet he still wants to embrace something he calls Christianity. I'm thinking of John Hick, perhaps, in the UK, who calls himself a Christian, but does not think that Jesus Christ was God incarnate. And I'm thinking of a book by Charles Taylor, The Sources of the Self, the second chapter of which describes the development of secularism. And I'm wondering how you might put those pieces together and how the Anabaptist movement would impact that.
There you go. Nice simple question there, Stuart. For you?
Do you want to go to first, Juliet?
Oh, no, that was directly to you, that one.
Yes, thank you, I think. I think one of the things that's worth trying to separate out is the difference between a secular culture and an ideology of secularism. You mentioned Charles Taylor's book. I've not read that one, but I have read his massive book called The Secular Age, which is, I think, a remarkable study of the development of a secular culture in the West and some of the inherent weaknesses within it. So for anybody who's interested in exploring more about the secular age, the secular culture, and teasing out the difference between secularization and secularism, I'd certainly recommend that as a good but pretty solid read. I think that the Anabaptist movement can count itself as one of the secularizing influences within Western culture, by which I mean not that they were encouraging people to move away from Christian faith, but that they were arguing quite strongly for the importance of a secular component within society, in particular the state. They recognized the importance of the state, they recognized the validity of the state, but they seemed to believe pretty strongly that to have a sacral state, to have a state that was based on religious principles and enforced by religious sanctions, really wasn't a helpful way of running society. And so the separation between church and state seems to me to be carving out a secular space within which it's possible for many different communities to flourish. So if we're moving out of Christendom, which is a sacred society where religion and politics were completely entwined, what is the Anabaptist vision for the future? It might be argued that actually the Anabaptist vision for post-Christendom is of a secular state acting as a kind of honest broker, providing a level playing field or a neutral context within which a range of philosophies, ideologies, and religious traditions can flourish. Seems to me that that is something which Anabaptists ought to be happy with. That rather than wanting a Christian government, and to have a thoroughly secular government, not in the sense of promoting secularism or atheism, but secular in the sense of non-aligned, neutral, not favouring one group over another. In a plural society like yours and ours, it seems to me that has a great deal going for it. Now, is that idealistic? Are we never going to have that kind of government? Is it always going to embrace ideology of one kind or another? I don't know. But it would seem to me that the Anabaptist vision is of an utterly secular state that is not dominated by a religious ideology, and an utterly Christian church that is not colluding with the power of the state or looking for those sorts of sanctions. So I'm just remember exactly what your question was now. I haven't gone off on that track for a bit, but it does seem to be that you're quite right that Anabaptism was part of a whole movement that could be traced back to the Renaissance and then through the Reformation to the Enlightenment, whereby the sacred culture of medieval Europe gradually became more and more secular. And I think a more secular culture, in the sense that I've described, is one that Anabaptists should welcome, provided it is genuinely secular and not secularist, providing that it provides opportunity and freedom for many different communities to be free and to flourish, rather than taking sides and showing favoritism. Some describe that as idealist, but actually the only alternative to a Christian government is some kind of ideological government that promotes very different values. I think I live in hope that there is a possibility of this more neutral alternative.
Okay, thank you very much. Very good question. Hold on. We have some from online. Do you want to tell us some of the questions?
This question, excuse me, this question is from Nancy and Herb Eichmann. And Stuart and Juliet hope for a wake-up call among the historic Anabaptist denominations. They say we do too. Hope realistic is their first question. Second, how can we sustain and nurture Anabaptism in congregations that have lost their Anabaptist identity?
That's a good question. I mean, from my perspective, I'm not sure my particular passion has been about seeing a wake-up call in Anabaptist churches, particularly. My passion has been about creating new churches with Anabaptist values. But that's perhaps because I haven't had a long time to journey with congregations of an Anabaptist flavour. So the more I get to know those congregations, the more passionate I might feel about encouraging them to embrace that. I mean, certainly many of the congregations that I have met seem to be embracing them very fully, actually, and are quite an inspiration to me. Although the more I learn about the different Anabaptist traditions, the more I discern that there are various flavours, and there are those that perhaps emphasise some values more than others. So perhaps there is a need for Anabaptist churches to have a wake-up call and have the courage to rekindle some of those values, especially in the light of what some of these other people are saying. Those quotes that Stuart read out of people that are almost asking those with Anabaptist roots to please stand up and show us how to respond in this context. That's a call that we have to listen to and discern how we can respond to that without falling into the traps of power and enjoying the fact that we have answers and people are looking to us, and we can be in all the Christian magazines and in the conferences, and suddenly we're flavour of the month. You know, that's a very tempting thing for Christians, but obviously it's just a phase. It comes and goes, doesn't it? So we don't run after that. But if the values are important to be communicating, maybe there are ways that we can find to offer those into the marketplace once again. But I don't know, Stuart, I mean, you've had more experience of working with a variety of Anabaptist congregations. Do you think there's a need for a wake-up call for some of those? Is it realistic?
Yes and yes, I think. I would want to answer to those.
Thank you. Moving
yes,
on.
I think one of the things that I've noticed is that interest in the Anabaptist story, in the history and the tradition, is strong among Anabaptist scholars and historians, but often isn't particularly strong within congregations, who are often more interested in contemporary methods and models, so more likely to be drawn to the purpose-driven church than to the writings of Benno Simons, if I can put it that way. And so I think there is some work to be done in terms of helping congregations rediscover their radical roots. I think that can be done best through stories. I'm sorry to go on about stories again, but I just think they are tremendously important. And I see Anabaptism as a narrative tradition. The stories that have been handed down through generations are important, but it is important which stories we tell. And I'm interested that some of the stories that I have been inspired by in the Anabaptist tradition don't seem to be well known in Anabaptist congregations. So, for example, one of my favourite stories concerns a German Anabaptist at the beginning of the 17th century by the name of Margaret Helvart. In 2 conferences in Canada over the last couple of weeks, I've mentioned this story and have asked these pastors' gatherings, so about 150 pastors in each place, how many of you have heard the story of Margaret Helvart? And in one gathering nobody had, in the other I think 2 people had. I'd be quite interested to know here, actually, I can't see you at the moment, but how many people know the story of Margaret Helvart in the early 17th century?
I can't hear the name very clearly. Stuart, can you just make... What's the name
Margaret
again?
Helvart.
Mark Helvart.
Margaret. She.
Margaret. Oh, it's a lady. Margaret Helvart. Anyone know the
Anybody
story
know?
of Margaret Helvart? No, that's a big fat zero.
Okay. Well, that doesn't surprise me. I'd been delighted if you had known her, but Margaret was a passionate evangelist who was so determined to share her faith with her neighbours that the only way the authorities could stop her was to bang a large stake into her kitchen floor and to chain Margaret's leg to the stake. And this was to enable her to continue cooking for the family, but make sure that she couldn't go out of the house to evangelise her neighbours. It's a wonderful story, not least because Margaret kept escaping from the stake, and the records suggest that the authorities had to reattach her to the stake 23 times over the next few years. She was a passionate evangelist. And I'm just interested as to why her story isn't better known in Anabaptist communities. Is it because passionate vocal evangelism has not really been something that historic Anabaptist congregations have been very comfortable with? There's been a huge emphasis on living the story rather than telling the story. So I do think there are opportunities to bring renewal through perhaps telling a wider range of stories than have sometimes been told. That's one suggestion. I think the second thing is I'm conscious that in some Anabaptist denominations and congregations there is a strong temptation to think, well, if only we adopted the methods of some of the growing conservative evangelical churches, then we would be growing and we would be doing fine. Now, I'm not suggesting that we can't learn from other traditions. I made it pretty clear earlier, I think we can. But I think we need to be very careful that we think through the values involved in some of the methods that other churches use. I think if we embrace methods that are antagonistic to our core values, we're going to be in real difficulties. So I do think there are warnings there. I think there is the opportunity of learning from others, but I think we need to be discerning as we try to do that. Is it feasible? I think it is, but again, I'd want to say what I said about churches generally moving into post-Christendom. I don't think all congregations are able to move in that direction. I think there will be some congregations which are not going to be able to make the transitions that we need. And for those, there is an important but difficult pastoral task of effectively being chaplains to a dying congregation. They just aren't going to be able to move into a very different cultural context. And they need to be helped to finish well, rather than being harangued about the need for change that perhaps they can't embrace. So I think where there is the possibility of change, where there's the possibility of renewal, let's draw on the Anabaptist stories. There are stories, there are some inspiring stories. If congregations can get hold of those, then the values can begin to make an awful lot of sense to them.
That's great. Thanks, Stuart. Is that where the phrase chain to the kitchen sink comes from, then, do you think?
Well, I think she was changing the floor rather than the sink, but nice idea.
Maybe that's where it's from. Okay, fantastic. Any other questions from the floor? I know we've got another one online in a moment. Any questions from the floor? No? Okay, online?
Okay. From Jonathan Brenneman, this is a question comment. Is there a chance that we see Anabaptism as too much as an identity and less a way of following Christ? The former requires us to strongly hold to our denominational identities. The latter allows us to identify the historical strengths and give voice to an Anabaptist identity that must exist simply by our nature as Christ followers, as shared earlier.
Okay, that's great. So there's a question there about identity and intentionality of the values. I mean, personally speaking as an outsider who is just getting to know some of the Anabaptist and Mennonite traditions, I would say that my awareness is that the identity is very strong. And in many ways it's to do with ethnicity, it's to do with a history and a story that many people are part of. And I really admire that. That doesn't seem to be apparent in the network that I'm part of in the UK. Perhaps also in the UK, we just don't have a very strong desire to trace our roots. But but I picked that up from many of the Anabaptist traditions here. There is that strong identity. You are Mennonite, for example, because your parents were Mennonite, and your grandparents were Mennonite, and your great-grandparents were Mennonite, and they came over on a ship from Germany. Or there's some kind of heritage there, which is just such a rich story to have. And I think, for me personally, it's just been interesting often to ask questions, okay, well, how can I become a Mennonite? In England, it's pretty impossible for me to become a Mennonite. There's one Mennonite church in London. I cannot go to that church regularly, so how do I become Mennonite, even if I identify with your values, for example? So I think for me that is an interesting issue. I think identity is very strong, and I also meet those from an Anabaptist tradition who have a very strong identity, but also a really strong intentionality about their values. I'm guessing there are those that have the strong identity without that intentionality. That I would just guess as an assumption that happens as well. So I think where I see the two, the identity and the intentionality, I see something incredibly rich and something incredibly transformative, actually, which others can aspire to be part of. But I think for us in the UK, one of the strengths of the Anabaptist network is that those of us who are beginning to develop Anabaptist tendencies can actually connect with others who are processing that as well, and who are developing an identity in the intentionality of the values. And that's perhaps one of our meeting points, so that we can learn from one another, encourage one another to keep our distinctiveness, and to learn from those that have much more richness and heritage in this than we have. And I think that's why we really enjoy connecting with those of you over here in the States and in Canada and elsewhere, because in listening to your story, and some of the stories that Stuart's mentioned, it gives us, it fleshes out the reality of what it could look like for us. And so for you guys who already have that, I can't understand why you don't draw on that really deeply. I'm sure many of you do, but for those who don't, I don't understand why perhaps they don't, because it seems incredibly rich to me, and we find immense help drawing from it. Stuart, do you have any thoughts on that, the identity intentionality question?
A couple of thoughts. Although, if Jeff Wright is listening, Jeff, I wonder whether you need to take Juliet shopping before she goes home and get her a bonnet. If she wants to become a Mennonite, you need to fit her out with the right kind of clothing.
I've been offered a bonnet from the Salvation Army before.
I know you need to get the right Mennonite bonnet. It's quite different. Just a couple of brief comments. One of those is that one of the dangers we face in the United Kingdom when we talk about Anabaptist is, as Juliet's just mentioned, there's only one well-established Mennonite church in the country. There is a more recently planted Brazilian Mennonite church down on the south coast, but that's very much in its early stages. So for most people, Anabaptism is an idea, it's a story, it's a set of core convictions. There's a real danger it becomes something quite ethereal and unearthed. Our bonnet is there. A true Mennonite. Fantastic. And this is being recorded online. I'm delighted. You have a convert, Jeff. But one of the dangers we have in the UK is the whole thing can become quite idealistic and not particularly earthed in history. And so one of the reasons I continue to come to North America to connect with Mennonite, Church of the Brethren in Christ congregations is that you have lived the story, you have earthed it in real communities over generations, and there was something very valuable about that. So this issue of identity is a tricky one. It's really important, I think, to distinguish some of the trappings of historical denominations from the essence of Anabaptism. That's why the Naked Anabaptist is in the attempt to do that. But as somebody quite rightly commented, there is actually no such thing as a Naked Anabaptist. Anabaptist values may be earthed in a variety of contexts, they may be expressed in a range of cultures, but they're never naked. You can't have the essence of Anabaptism without it being clothed in some way. But I think the value of being part of a global Anabaptist community is that you can see Anabaptist values, principles and practices being worked out in a range of cultural settings. And that perhaps helps us to tease out what really is at the heart of the vision from some of the identity issues that are perhaps separate. So I would say it's a tricky one, and I think there will always be this overlap between the essence, the heart, the core, and the way in which it is worked out in practice. As long as those things are held in creative tension, then I think that's fine. The only other comment I'd make is, again, I think I said towards the end of the book, fundamentally, I'm not interested in being an Anabaptist. That's a designation that I've used of myself for a quarter of a century now, but fundamentally I'm interested in being a follower of Jesus. And for me, the Anabaptist tradition has been unusually helpful in pointing me back to Jesus, to the Gospels, to the heart of the Christian tradition. I'm very happy to identify as an Anabaptist. I'm very happy for that to be a significant part of my identity, but it's only ever a secondary identity. The primary identity is a follower of Jesus, and Anabaptism simply is a resource for that. And I think that's an important reminder in a context where Anabaptism is becoming quite popular. It's not a substitute for the core Christian tradition.
Well, let's just take a break from the questions. We might just get an opportunity before the next coffee break to explore a couple more. But what I'd like to do before we break for coffee is just to tell you a little bit of the story of urban expression, and really how that has embraced some of the Anabaptist values. I mean, I think for us, these particular values are important to us. The whole essence of discipleship being about following Jesus rather than just going on a course. The value on hospitality and community has been immensely valuable. It did make me laugh because when Stuart's book came out here in the States not that long ago, I think it was launched at some big conference somewhere, and I heard someone on Facebook or somewhere wrote up how many thousands of copies it had sold, and it had done really well. It was the second highest selling book of the whole conference. I thought, wow, that's amazing. People are really interested in this. The highest selling book was about what? Cooking. It was a cookery book. And I just thought, wow, what does this say about the Mennonite tradition? That actually food is really, really important, which is great. Actually, for those of us with urban expression as well, that sense of hospitality, welcoming, being inclusive of people who are different to us, sharing our resources and sharing our homes has been really fundamental in what we've been doing. Peace and evangelism. Peace in terms of not only peacemaking and being prepared to get involved in reconciliation and being prepared to go into environments which probably exhibit quite a lot of tension and being prepared to work that through. And evangelism, I mean, perhaps from my observation, some Anabaptist groups seem more wary of evangelism than others. Some seem, very, very keen on it. Others seem a little bit reluctant to kind of push our truth onto others. And I wonder whether these two things go together very well, actually. The desire to witness, but actually also to be doing that in a peaceful kind of way. I don't know, I mean, we can discuss that a bit. But I think that's an interesting connection. And both of those things are important to urban expression. We're thoroughly committed to sharing our faith, thoroughly committed to giving people opportunity to learn about Jesus and respond to him, but operating in many multicultural, multi-faith contexts which demand an approach which is very peaceful and not one that's going to ignite even more tension and polarisation. And for us, I think rediscovering the radical Jesus is definitely something that we have been really focused on, and trying to reconnect with the dangerous Jesus, the Jesus who got himself arrested. There are reasons why Jesus got killed. He didn't get killed for just being a nice bloke going around doing nice things. He must have been a pretty controversial figure, and he was prepared to do that even in the midst of his peacemaking and his integrity and everything. There was something dangerous about him, and I think for those who get involved in urban expression, there is a sense of risk-taking, that we are doing something that's a little bit outside of the ordinary, something that some people will criticise us for, some people won't understand why we're doing it, but we are prepared to take a risk and to do this because we follow a dangerous, risk-taking Jesus. And so urban expression, just as a little snapshot really, started 15 years ago in the UK. Stuart at the time was teaching at a Baptist theological college called Spurgeon's College. I had studied there a couple of years earlier. And I guess there were various frustrations going on. There were frustrations that there were lots of people learning about church planting, and especially in the 1990s, there was a big push on church planting in the UK, so lots of people were learning about church planting, but it seemed that comparatively very few people were getting on and doing it. And the other frustration linked to that was that those who were getting on and doing church planting were actually going to places where there were already loads of churches, which raised questions for us because there are significant gaps in the UK and these people weren't particularly choosing to go to those. The other frustration was that those who were involved in church planting were not only going to places where there were already churches, but they seemed to be planting churches that looked rather similar to all the other churches that were around them. And we just wondered why people weren't taking hold of this opportunity to reimagine, reevaluate, take some risks, experiment, and try and do something different. Surely that's the whole point of church planting. Rather than doing the same thing over and over and again and expecting different results, let's try and do something a little bit different. And so urban expression was set up, really just with Stuart, my husband Jim, and myself sitting together in our front room and dreaming of what could happen. And we said, wouldn't it be great if we could just recruit some teams to move into inner city communities, to be self-financing, because we've got no money to make this happen. And to be honest, if we were to try and raise some money, it would just take us years. We would have to do so much work to get different agencies on board and to apply for grants, and it would just take all our time to get the funding in place. And we just thought funding is such a big obstacle, let's just go round it. Let's find a way round this big fat obstacle because it's just impossible to go over it. And so this is our mission statement really. It's a bit long-winded, but it says it all in one go. We are an urban mission agency that recruits, equips, deploys and networks self-financing teams, pioneering creative and relevant expressions of the Christian church in underchurched areas of the inner city. And so together with my husband Jim, we decided that we were going to head up this first urban expression team. We were going to move from Birmingham in the Midlands of England, move down into London. We looked at London and tried to work out which was the least churched area of London, which is the area that the least number of Christians choose to go to. And we narrowed it down to just 2 boroughs in the east of London. We recognised that one of those boroughs was experiencing massive immigration from Africa, and we could see the potential of that, and we knew that that was, within a very short time, that was going to have far more churches than anywhere else in London. And so we went for the other borough, a borough called Tower Hamlets, very multicultural, and one where people are desperate to leave Tower Hamlets. All people are quite desperate to leave Tower Hamlets, or they certainly were when we started 15 years ago. And so we decided that we would ring around our friends and see if anyone was crazy enough to come and join us and move in. We were offering them no money, no accommodation, no job, no guarantee of success. We just thought it would be a laugh. Let's do it. What could possibly go wrong? And amazingly, 4 friends decided to join us, and then 2 other young ladies who were independently trying to explore a similar kind of concept were put in touch with us, and the 8 of us decided that we would go for this. And so together we moved in and began to try and work out what it meant to be church in that neighbourhood. We went on a roller coaster journey, which involved lots of listening to our community, a lot of trying to work out what God was already doing there. We tried not to rush in with our preconceived ideas of what should happen. We tried not to rush in and start programs in order to justify our presence. It was very difficult because urban expression was very new. Some people were quite suspicious about it. Some people wanted us to justify what we were doing. And when we told them that we were just hanging around in coffee shops and, just trying to get ourselves established in employment and trying to get to know people in the community, sometimes people really criticised that because we hadn't yet started a Sunday morning church and a Sunday school and a house group and all of these things. But we persisted, and eventually, over time, we morphed into something that looked a bit like church. We were very grateful that one of the early things we discerned was that nobody in our community was out of bed on a Sunday morning. And so we decided that it would be rather foolish to try and do church on a Sunday morning, which was great. So for 10 years we had no church on a Sunday morning, and instead we met on a Wednesday evening and on a Sunday evening in homes. And it was just been a fantastic adventure, not without its costs, because we chose to work and to embrace people on the margins of society, people with a whole host of challenges, and we all opened our homes up to those and got involved in their lives. But the interesting thing was, for us, we could have just been the only team, and we didn't think there would be any other people foolish enough to join us, really. But they did. And other people followed the first team's footsteps and discerned other communities that they should move into. And so over the last 15 years, urban expression has grown considerably. We have had 8 teams in London. We've had 5 teams in Manchester, 4 teams in Manchester. We've had a team in Glasgow. We have 2 teams in Bristol. We have 1 in Birmingham. And we have 2 in Stoke-on-Trent. I know these names might not mean anything to you. But so we have a variety of teams spread across the UK, each involved in a variety of different things. And then it was interesting because we were just busy getting on with things in the UK, and we were approached by some friends in the Netherlands who were involved in something very similar, and we discovered that the similarities were so close. We talked about linking together. So there are currently 4 teams in the Netherlands, and we just try and hook up with them occasionally. They are an independent organisation. They're free to just get on and shape it in the way that's appropriate for them. We're trying not to become an imperialistic kind of organisation that assumes that everyone in Britain should be in charge. Actually, the Dutch probably know what's best for the Netherlands. Then had increasing conversations with Jeff and others here in North America about some initiatives that were starting here, and decided that it would be great to hook up. And more recently in Sweden, we've had a couple of people over there who again have said that this way of church planting just seems to make sense in their context, and so they are trying to work out what that looks like over there. And it's interesting because I sometimes wonder what it is that people are drawn to with urban expression. I mean, we are not a big organisation. This year, we will have recruited our 100th team member. Each team member gives a minimum of 3 years commitment. but many of those team members end up giving much longer than that. Out of those 100 people, I think probably only 3 or 4 have left before their 3-year commitment. So, I mean, do you know, that is not an insignificant amount of investment into the inner city, but it's by no means a huge mission agency at all. And we wonder what people are looking for in us. As an organisation based in the UK, we still operate with less than 2 full-time staff between us all. So there's a mixture of people. I work 3 days a week. My husband works 2 days a week. Stuart works 1 or 2 days a week. We have a couple of other regional coordinators. But between us all, it's less than 2 full-time posts. So in a sense, there's not a whole heap that we can offer. It's quite limited. It means that it's quite cheap. We're not looking for vast overheads. We don't have an office to run. We all work from home. We all utilise free communications as much as possible and make it as cheap as possible. But I think for us, the thing that seems to draw people is our values. And I haven't brought a whole set with me today. I'm really sorry. You can look at them on our website. If you look at the liturgy booklet, which I showed you earlier, which is on the table, if you flick through that, you will see what the values are at the beginning of each prayer. But essentially, they base around these 3 values here: relationship, creativity, and humility. I think relationship is definitely something we see modelled in many of the Anabaptist communities that we see. Relationship is very important. It's not just about projects and achievements. The relationship itself is of deep value. I think the way many Anabaptists talk to one another and listen to one another and value one another's perspectives is intrinsic in that, and we seek to embody that as well. I think the humility side of things is undoubtedly modelled through many Anabaptist values that we see. And I have to say, I don't know about the creativity. I think certainly in history, the Anabaptists have been very creative, trying to dodge persecution. That takes some creativity. Settling into new places, learning what it is to be travellers and to be exiles. You've been very, very creative in that sense. What it looks like now, I'm not sure, and perhaps that's one of the challenges for us as we seek to reinterpret things for post-Christendom context. So, I mean, that's a very brief introduction to urban expression, but I think we are just one of several agencies that are really beginning to try and draw on these Anabaptist values and to work them out in practice in our context in the UK. Stuart, do you want to mention any other agencies that we're aware of with similar kind of backgrounds?
One of the things that has developed in the last 2 or 3 years with the Anabaptist Network, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, and that's 20 years of being a network of individuals from a variety of backgrounds, places and so on who have discovered the Anabaptist tradition. But the last 2 or 3 years we have also formed a network of organisations who are held together not by a common task, but by this shared set of values. So within the Anabaptist network of organisations, as well as urban expression that Juliet's just been talking about, there are a number of others with very different mandates and vocations. So there is the well-established London Mennonite Centre, which is a teaching, training and resourcing place. There is a group called Bridge Builders, which used to be part of the Mennonite Centre, but is now an independent charity that is heavily involved in resourcing congregations in terms of conflict transformation. There is another group called Workshop, which for the last 30 years almost, doing a quite radical Christian discipleship training course. That's been quite an interesting one because it has refused consistently to label itself as Anabaptist, because it's not wanted to pigeonhole itself too much. It's wanted to be open to people of any tradition. I've taught on that course, must be at least 15 years now, and normally have taught towards the end of the 1-year programme, and specifically have taught on the subject of post. And suddenly people have been saying, oh, right, that makes sense then of what we've been doing in workshop. This is an Anabaptist course, isn't it? At which point they're so well into workshop that it doesn't matter, they know. So it's been a kind of subversive Anabaptist presence, and one of the ways in which people have connected with Anabaptism. There's another group called Ecclesia, which is a political think tank, and which has managed to position itself in such a way as to be regularly invited to comment on a whole range of social, political, economic issues, and does so from a pretty distinctively Anabaptist tradition, very often irritating the kind of mainstream Christian community because they'll come at issues from quite a different and more radical angle. There's also a group called Speak. Speak is a young adults and students justice campaigning organisation. It's relatively young. It's young in terms of the people involved. It's only been going about 8 or 9 years, I think. And we encountered them at a Christian festival a few years ago. And as we got to know each other, as we looked at each other's values and interests, the leaders said to us, well, we're Anabaptists, really, aren't we? And we looked at their values and said, yes, we think we probably are. So we're wanting to develop stronger and stronger links with Speak, not least because of their age range. In many ways, they may represent at least part of the next generation of Anabaptism in the UK. So that's a range of the organisations. Held together by these shared values, by relationship, rather than by all doing the same thing together.
That's great. Thanks very much, Stuart. So, in a sense, today what we've done is we've unpacked a little bit of this changing world that is happening around us, and we've just taken a look back at some of our ancient paths, and we're asking the question, how do they intersect with where we're at today? I'm going to suggest that we take a break now. And when we come back, we're really going to look at the third section of our day together, Future Church. So what does the future look like? Taking on board all of these changes and our ancient heritage and our roots, what does that mean for the potential for the future? And we're going to ask some questions about whether initiating new churches is one response to this and what that might look like. So let's take a break for 15 minutes, have some coffee, and we'll be back at 2:45. Okay, so for this final session, we're going to be asking a few questions about the topic of church planting. And Stuart and I would like to suggest to you today that we do believe that church planting is a vital response to the situation that we're in at the moment. Absolutely vital. But it isn't an optional extra, but it is something that we need to be looking at creatively and intentionally. I mean, let me ask you a question just to begin with. From the networks that you are part of here, the Church of the Brethren in Christ, what would you say are the main reasons why you plant churches? I'm presuming that you do on occasions. What are the main reasons why churches get planted in your networks? Just shout out to me some reasons. Are there any particular reasons? Whatever reasons. To create a job. Okay, to create a job for somebody. Okay, so like a pastor, you mean? Pastor? Hang on, I'm going to put the microphone here.
I'm going to use language that I can't think of something better, but I know that churches want to increase their influence, and so will, plant satellites or other things. Sometimes it's church motivated, and sometimes it's kingdom motivated. It depends on the church that's doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there are a whole mix of reasons. So sometimes it's about extending influence. Sometimes there are kingdom reasons. Sometimes there are just, influence reasons as well. Any other reasons?
This church was planted because we thought Riverside didn't have an expression that the Brethren in Christ. So we thought it needed it.
So you've identified a need and responded to it. Any other reasons? Okay, at the back.
James Chronister wrote, to try to plant something new which has not been infected by traditional church, as well as attract those who will not be reached by a local church.
That's great. That's an interesting use of word. I like that. Something that hasn't been infected by, what was it? Infected by, what was the phrase again? By traditional church. That's very interesting. As someone who is forced to watch a number of zombie programs and films by the male members of my family, the idea of something being infected in a bad way, that's a great analogy. There are lots of different reasons why we might be interested in church planting. I'm just going to reel off a whole list of possible ideas. So we might think about planting churches in order to replace churches that have closed. We might think about church planting to replace ineffective churches that are not engaged in mission in their community. We might think of planting churches in order to penetrate society more effectively, planting churches closer to where people live, being more accessible. We might want to respond to population increases or changes that might motivate us to plant new churches. We might want to relocate and distribute Christians more strategically across society. We might literally want to release space in overfull buildings. I suspect that in certain parts of the States that's quite a big issue perhaps. If the church is large and they can't fit any more people in, perhaps they think about doing it for that reason. We might think about planting churches in order to provide new opportunities for service and leadership. And I'm sure this doesn't happen over here, but we might think about planting churches in order to release tension and head off damaging splits in the church. I'm sure you never have splits over here, but we do. We might also think about planting churches in order to provide a wider range of churches and more options for connecting with people, or to offer opportunities to experiment and help the church adapt to a changing culture. And the final two, possibly to enable targeted and specialised churches, that should be, to be formed. And finally, we might plant churches in order to act as catalysts for denominations. There's a whole range of reasons there, isn't there? And it's important for us to be aware of why we're going into church planting, what are the motivating factors behind it. I would like to suggest to you this afternoon that I think some of the key reasons why we need to be planting churches today, and all of these are relevant, all of these are valid reasons to be planting churches. But I guess from an urban expression perspective, there are particular motives that we have. And one of our key things is this, to relocate and redistribute Christians more strategically across society. And for us, this is a huge concern for ours, that we simply do not have enough Christians living in some of our most challenging and most deprived communities. Certainly in the UK, and I would hazard a guess that that is true in the States as well, because essentially these are perhaps communities that people would rather not live in, and so it's much more attractive to live elsewhere. For us, that's just a huge challenge. Because actually, when we look at the person of Jesus, we're somebody who was prepared to be incarnational and to walk alongside some of the most vulnerable people. And so in a small way, we want to be open to doing that. And so that's why for us, we intentionally look out some of the least churched places. And there's also some statistical data that we use to try and locate the poorest neighbourhoods in the UK as well, and that we would intentionally try and prioritise those. We do that out of our own passion, but we're also trying to be quite prophetic to some of the denominations around us, because to be fair, although there are some denominations that have got some fantastic presence in these neighbourhoods, by and large, many of our denominations have become middle class, stereotypically middle class networks of Christians. And we don't think that that's right. We don't think that that is okay for a denomination to look at itself and to realise that it is simply a middle class organisation getting on with doing things in a nice middle class way. We have some responsibilities to those who are never going to be able to connect with that. And so for us, this is a deep passion of ours, and something that we're constantly trying to challenge our denominations back in the UK about. Those communities that are deprived in some shape or form may look different in different places. For us, we use the phrase inner city because those communities tend to be fairly central to our cities, outside the business district, but not quite in suburbia. But in Sweden, for example, they are actually on the suburbs of the cities. The poor are shipped out to communities on the edges of their city. I don't know what it looks like in your context here, but it's about finding out where those most marginalised, most frequently overlooked people groups are and choosing to engage with them. And for us, that's a real reason for planting churches and prioritising that. I think one of the other main reasons for us is up here, to offer opportunities to experiment and help the church adapt to a changing culture. And I believe that this is a real challenge for all denominations, because especially those of us who are actually doing okay with planting churches, perhaps we have models that work, perhaps we have tried and tested methods that we can fall back on, and we're content with that. We know that we need this much money to employ a pastor, we need this much money to buy them a house, we know we need this much money to rent a building or to buy a building. We know what works. And so therefore, when we have the money in place, we'll start a new church somewhere, or when we have the right person ready, we'll get on and do it. And I think for us, one of the things we feel really challenged about is actually to provide opportunities that go outside of that box. Because that's not a bad box. And actually it does some great things. But actually it's really, really limited, incredibly limited. If we're only going to be planting churches when we have enough money and when we have the right building, then we are really limited. Not only in the number of times that we can do it, but also we are limited in terms of the model that we are working towards. And I think for us with Urban Expression, the decision to go down a self-financing route has just opened up huge opportunities. You might think that it would be an unattractive model and it would be something for just a few oddballs to take part in. But actually we have discovered more and more that there are people who are feeling perhaps restricted within their denominational networks. They're feeling that they want to push the boundaries. They're feeling that they want to experiment, but actually in waiting for their denominations to catch up with them, they're losing faith that the denomination ever will, and so they're trying to find a way of getting on with it on their own. They're fed up with waiting for funding to become available. They're fed up with waiting for housing to become available. It's just not going to happen. And so they need to find an outlet for that creativity. And we've just been surprised at the number of even ordained clergy from a variety of different networks in the UK who have come to Urban Expression and said, can we plant a church with you? We release teams to plant churches with whatever network or denomination. We don't want to become a denomination. We have no hopes of that at all. We simply want to recruit teams, release them, let them go off and do their thing, and support them while they're doing it. And it's just been fascinating to see some ministers, some pastors who have been working in traditional church contexts for a long time, doing a brilliant job at it. They've been growing churches, they've been teaching churches, they've been doing a fantastic job. And yet they can see that the church is becoming less and less and less relevant to the masses of people. And they're wanting to do something about it, and yet there are no opportunities to do that within their denomination, because all their denomination wants to do is to appoint ministers to establish churches, or to church plants that are going to look like established churches. And so they're coming to Urban Expression more or less for permission to go and experiment and do something different. Now, we're really happy about that. We're excited about that. We're happy to have all of these people come and join in with what we're doing. We're learning together. We're making mistakes together, having good fun together, crying together. But the frustration is that these people could be doing this within their networks. They could be helping their denominations to forge a way ahead in creativity and finding new ways of doing things. And I think for us, this final point here about acting as catalysts for denominations, the pioneers amongst us, those who are looking to push the boundaries, are the ones that can catalyse us for this future that is round the corner. If only we're brave enough to take hold of them, give them permission to go and do their thing, whatever it looks like, and to release them to do it however we can, without necessarily waiting for the traditional things like money and housing. But most of the time, in my experience, these pioneers aren't looking for all of those things. Actually, what they're looking for is a welcome and permission to fly. And actually, they're quite happy to take a risk and try and work out these other things. As long as they're being held within their family, they're content to take a risk. And I just encourage us to maybe think about how we can release those people. So for me, these are some of the reasons why we should be planting churches today. Stuart, what do you think if we don't plant churches today? What are the consequences if we don't go down that route, do you think?
Well, I guess some of the consequences are the opposites of what Juliet's just been saying. Let me start with this denominational change lever. Nations are a little bit like supertankers that aren't easy to turn around quickly. If you want to turn a supertanker around, you have to plan ahead, and it takes quite a long time. And after a while, denominations get into that kind of mode of being. And it's realistically quite difficult to make the kinds of changes fast enough that may be needed in a changing culture. I think one of the things we need to just emphasize about the changes taking place in our culture, in one sense they're slow. Post-Christendom is not going to happen in about 5 years' time. Post-Christendom is a transition that's taking generations rather than just a few years. So in one sense there is time to adjust. But the rate of change of some of the elements within post-Christendom and post-modernity are pretty rapid. And people are speaking quite a bit about not just change, but discontinuous change. So change is happening in such a way that it's hard to see where it's heading, it's hard to make plans. There are certainly some people now who, if they hear the word strategy or 5-year plan, just fall about laughing. That was a very old way of thinking about things. The idea of a business making a 5-year plan in such a radically and rapidly changing culture is often perceived simply as laughable. So if we have denominational structures that's inevitably going to take some time to turn around, how are we going to exercise the influence necessary? And I don't know of any better way than church planting. It's not that no other change levers are available, it's not that congregations and denominations can't change in other ways, but church planting seems to have a particular genius in terms of putting issues on the agenda, challenging some of the norms, encouraging people to think outside of the box. So I would want to emphasize what Juliet's just been saying and to suggest that is really quite significant. Now, it has to be said that for most church planters, changing their denomination is not at the top of their list of priorities. They're normally passionate about a particular community, or passionate about the opportunity of planting into a church and seeing what happens. The idea that what they're doing could be of great significance for the denomination that they may feel strongly attached to, or maybe fairly loosely attached to, perhaps isn't uppermost in their thinking. But for denominational leaders, for those with regional or national responsibility, I think it's tremendously important to see church planting in that broader perspective and to find ways of keeping in touch with pioneers to learn from them. Church planting will be of no value as a denominational change leader if the pioneers just go off and do their own thing. If they don't report back, if there isn't a relationship, if the lessons they're learning aren't embraced, if there's no two-way communication between them, then I think we're wasting multiple opportunities. So I'm not suggesting that denominational change should be the primary motivation for church planting. I don't know any church planter who would say that is their primary motivation, but I do think it's a significant issue. And if we don't encourage church planting from our denominations, I think we're missing out on something really very significant. The second thing is just to, again, emphasize something that Juliet said a few moments ago, the opportunity to explore and to experiment. Now, again, there's no reason why churches that are 20, 40, 60, 100 years old and more can't experiment, and indeed in a changing culture, I think we'll need to do that. But I do think that realistically there are limits to how far and how fast change can proceed in more established congregations. Those of you who are church leaders will surely recognise that there are some things in your congregation that you can introduce as changes and nobody will blink. There are things you could do tomorrow morning in your church, and it's fine. It may be a bit different from what you've done before, but nobody's going to worry that you will get away with it. In fact, people might even like it, enjoy it. There are other things that if you were to do them tomorrow or sometime in the near future, you probably can get away with. People will go with you if they trust you, but you know that it's beginning to push up against people's comfort zones. You're beginning just to pose questions for them as to, what's going on here? And if there's good trust and good relationship, then it may be okay, but you recognise that you're beginning to move into slightly risky territory. And then there are other changes which you know that if you were to try to introduce them, you would need to spend a long time consulting, a long time discussing, a long time gaining ownership, and there's no guarantee you'll get there. You may or may not. But if you're wise, you won't force them through, you will take time to discuss them. You may get there, you may not. Sometimes you recognise that there are battles that just aren't worth fighting. And then there's another raft of changes beyond that, which you wouldn't even dream of introducing to the church. You know that it would cause mayhem. You know that people would be upset and hurt and just wouldn't understand what these changes are for. And you simply wouldn't try. At least, that's the case, I would suggest, if you're wise. And so, within existing congregations, there are a range of possible changes, some of which are feasible and helpful, others of which are going to cause such damage to the community that you really can't go there. And yet some of those changes may be the things that are needed to enable the congregation to move confidently into a very different future. So how do you encourage the church to make those sorts of changes? But again, I want to suggest that one way is church planting. That if we don't plant churches, we're missing out on a very significant opportunity to experiment, to explore, and to demonstrate to the existing congregations that there are other ways of doing things which might be worth considering. Somebody has called church planting laboratories of the Spirit, places where we can experiment under God, places where we can follow what we sense to be the leading of the Spirit, where we can do that without destroying what we already have. If the existing church is able to form a partnership, a relationship with a newly planted church, there is the possibility of two-way traffic. Church plant can gain all sorts of help from the experience, the history, the resources of the older church. But the older church can look at what the newer one is doing and test out some of the possibilities. Things that they wouldn't have thought of doing in their own community. If they see it happening, if they see it lived out and worked out somewhere else, it makes the possibility of doing something similar in their own context more manageable. Whereas it's not quite as scary as perhaps they thought it was. So both of these first two issues really do depend on relationship. If church planting is going to be a denominational change leader, then pioneers need to be linked in with the denomination and with the strategists within that denomination. If it's to be a source of renewal and stimulus for existing congregations, then those congregations need to have relationships with the pioneers and the church planters. I think a third issue is, what do we do with pioneers if we don't get involved in church planting? I don't know what your congregation is like, but there may well be some pioneers within it. Within most congregations, there is somebody with a bit of a pioneering spirit. And the difficulty is often to know quite what to do with pioneers. They're not always the most comfortable people to have around. In fact, the dividing line between a pioneer and a pain in the neck is pretty thin. And it's not always easy to work out what you've got. Is it someone who's just cussed and awkward, or is it someone with a pioneering spirit and a gift from God that needs to be released and set free? Now, I recognise that there are other ways in which you can encourage pioneers, but church planting seems to me to be one of the primary ways. Juliet was talking earlier about some of the people who come to Open Expression. Not all of the people who come to us are necessarily sensing a call to the inner city, to work with the urban poor, but for many of them, they're looking for anywhere where they can meet with other pioneers, where they can find encouragement and support, and people who understand them. A comment we quite often get from people is that it's such a relief to be in a context where they haven't got to keep explaining themselves and defending themselves. Pioneers need other pioneers in order to flourish. If we don't have opportunities for church planting, I think we may be in danger of squandering the pioneering spirits, of endangering the health and the spirituality of those who have these pioneering gifts. But if we are moving into a rapidly changing culture, it seems to me that the pioneers are going to be essential for our future. We need them. We need to release them. We need to hold them accountable, certainly, but we also need to encourage them, to nurture them, to support them, and to learn from them. That's something else that I think we'd be missing out on if we don't encourage church planting. That's one other thing to mention, and then hand back, well, maybe two things, but briefly. First of all, if we don't plant churches, how are we going to reach the segments of the population that are culturally distant from our existing churches? You may have the idea, you may even have an ideology that says, we're a church for everybody. Anybody in our neighbourhood, anybody in our town, our city, we welcome at this church. And you may genuinely mean it. But the reality isn't quite that simple. Churches have cultures, and it's quite difficult for people who are very different from the mainstream culture in a church to really feel at home there. I'm not suggesting that we should in any way make it harder than it is already. I think we need to push well beyond our comfort zones in terms of welcoming people that are different from us. But realistically, there may be limits beyond which any congregation can't stretch. One of the interesting developments over the last 10 years in church planting has been what Juliet described earlier as targeted or specialised churches. Churches that are specifically designed for the kinds of people who do not naturally and easily fit into existing churches. I think Juliet's planning to say more about the kinds of churches that we may plant later on, so I won't say too much more on that. But there are networks of people, there are cultures and subcultures that are very, very poorly represented in our churches. Church planting gives us an opportunity to focus on them, to see if we can find ways of creating church that makes sense to them. Let me just give you a couple of examples, just to illustrate what I mean, without going much further than that. Let me give you a couple of examples from Australia, where they've been working on this for quite a while. I was in Melbourne a few years ago, and found myself in conversation with a young church planter who was just in the early stages of trying to plant a church into the sci-fi community in the city, science fiction community. Kind of people who dress up as Mr. Spock and go to Star Trek conventions. The kind of people who get their lightsabers out and have mock Star Wars battles. You know the kind of people, they're probably deacons in your church, that kind of thing. But in reality, this is not a subculture that's well represented in most of our churches. And if there are people in your churches who are into sci-fi in that way, they probably don't feel particularly affirmed by the church in that particular interest. They may well not say anything about it. They probably don't come dressed up as Mr. Spock in practice. This guy in Melbourne was saying, well, rather than trying to persuade one or two isolated individuals from this underground subculture to try our churches, why don't we see if we can plant a church into that subculture? Why don't we see if we can connect with the whole community and do it in a way that explicitly makes links between the gospel and some of the themes within science fiction? Now, I only saw them at the very beginning of this project, so I don't know what's happening. I hope to find out at some point. But that seemed to me to be a creative, missional attempt. And I don't know whether there is any better way of reaching that subculture than through church planting. It might be that an existing church could develop a specialised ministry or outreach towards them, but I suspect probably church planting is the more appropriate way. Second example from Australia, met another young man, I think in Sydney this time, who was in the process of planting a church among surfers on the Gold Coast. And while that sounds a very congenial atmosphere for church planting, what he was saying was that the male surfer is about as unchurched as you can get in Australia. They just don't come to the regular churches. And his suggestion was, might it be possible for us to plant a church into the surfing community, to go where they are, to share their interests, to build community among them? Not that you want a church entirely made up of surfers forever, but that if you're able to break into that community, then in due time, through their families, through their friends and others, you may see something much more heterogeneous developed. So that seems to me to be another reason why church planting is essential. If we don't plant churches, how are we going to reach these communities? If we don't plant churches, I think we need to come up with an alternative strategy which is just as effective. Finally, very briefly, it seems to me that there are good theological reasons for planting churches which would be wise not to ignore. If we were to change the language from church planting to church reproduction, maybe we get the point. One of my colleagues here in the UK, and an Anglican colleague, is arguing quite strongly that we've done enough with horticulture, with church planting and seeding and that kind of thing. But actually what we're really needing to talk about is human. It's about reproduction. It's about how communities reproduce themselves in the same way as adult humans reproduce themselves in their children. And that there's nothing more unnatural about than there is about childbirth. Not even adults have children, but there's absolutely nothing abnormal or unusual about a married couple having children. That is perceived as normal. Reproduction is part of the human urge to continue. Why can't we apply that, he says, to churches? There's no reason why churches should just get older and older and older and older. Why not instead think in terms of a life cycle of reproduction? If we don't get involved in church planting, there's a real danger that we miss out on something which is built into the very order of creation for churches, for all communities, as well as for human individuals. So I don't know if that's enough reasons to plant churches, or enough issues to raise about what happens if we don't. Let me hand back.
Thanks very much, Stuart. I would like to ask you just to turn to the person behind you and just to ask you what's the most creative church plant you're aware of, or the most creative church. What's an example of a group of Christians who are pushing the boundaries and doing something that is really reaching those who wouldn't normally connect with church? Yeah, and just share a story. If you know of one, you might not know of one, but if you do know, just turn to the person next to you, quickly share that story with one another. Okay, hopefully you've managed to think of a few examples that have inspired you. And wow, that's a loud phone call, we can all hear it. So we all say hi. So Stuart has been unpacking what might happen if we don't plant churches today. I just want to throw into that one interesting quote, which I use quite regularly. And for me, this is incredibly challenging for us. And it says this, and this isn't written from a Christian context, this is to do with business. And it's actually several years old now. So if this was true several years ago, you can imagine how much more true it is today. And it says this, as the rate of change increases, the complexity of the problems that face us also increases. The more complex these problems are, the more time it takes to solve them. The more the rate of change increases, the more problems that face us change, and the shorter is the lifespan of the solutions we find to them. Therefore, by the time we find solutions to many of the problems that face us, usually the problems have so changed that our solutions to them are no longer relevant or effective. As a result, we are falling further and further behind our times. And it strikes me that in the realms of church planting, this summarises exactly why we need to be proactively in the business of creating new expressions of church, not just on the odd occasion, but regularly and intentionally. And if we're not doing it often, then we need to be asking serious questions about why we're not doing it. Because even if we are creating new forms of church on a regular basis every year for the next 10 years, we are still going to be falling behind the times. But behind the times less than if we don't get on and do it. It's a challenge for us to at least be trying to respond to the rapid changes that are taking place before us. And I guess just as we begin to draw things to a close, we've got time for some questions before we finish. But I guess one question to finish with is what kind of churches do we plant? And I'm just going to show this picture. This is a picture that Stuart uses a lot. I really like it. Just take a look at the picture. Maybe eventually you might notice the slight abnormality in the picture. Would anyone like to tell us what's going on here? What's the man painting? Well, he's on the canvas, it's a bird. But the model is an egg. And Stuart and I both really like this picture, because it says something incredibly prophetic, doesn't it? That the artist is not just looking at the egg for what it is, but he is looking at the egg for what it will become if it is looked after and nurtured in the right way. It's looking at the potential that it has. And I believe that pioneers and church planters are artists like this. They are a pain in the neck sometimes, but essentially they are artists. They are people who see things for what they could become. They are people that have that creativity of a creative God that can see something before it's even formed, and they desire to be part of the process of bringing that about and bringing it into being. And so I think for us, in terms of the churches that we should be planting, I mean, I don't want to give you models of what you should be doing. It's not about finding the right model to reproduce. It's about finding the people who can envisage what could be and releasing them to get on and do it, even if they're not really sure what it's going to look like, which is a real pain for those of us who are in positions of responsibility, and we have forms to complete, and we have grant applications to complete, and we have to convince the committee that this person is worth giving money to. And it's really difficult when they fill in the form and they say, I don't know what this is going to look like. And I don't know what my goals and, I don't know what it's going to look like in 12 months' time, and how many people I anticipate coming to church, and what their tithing income will be, and when we will become self-sufficient financially. I don't know. And actually, I don't think it's so much about the model that they're presenting. Is this person somebody that you see as an artist? Is this person somebody for whom the Spirit of God is within them, and you are convinced that they are seeing something of what God can do? And if so, will you trust them to go forth and to try and create something in the image of God? And if you trust them, then give them your money and set them free and support them while they do it. And if you don't have any money, just release them and give them permission and support them anyway. And help them to creatively find ways of financing themselves so they don't go under with all the stress of it. The people who write in the margins are the people that we want. We want the people who colour outside of the lines. The people who look at things slightly differently. Because to be honest, we've had all of the people that colour within the lines, haven't we? We've had all of the people that write on the lines and don't write in the margins. And they've done a great job. And we've created lots of churches that do a fantastic job. And this isn't about either or, because we live in a world where there are two paradigms, and people still come to know and love Jesus through our regular churches, and that is fantastic, and that is going to happen for the foreseeable future. And it's not about throwing that out, but it's recognizing a whole heap more people. And so do we only want to operate a dime, or do we want to multi, which is mixed economy? Do we want to become a mixed economy church where we believe in more than one model? In fact, we believe in several different models. So who are your people that write in the margins? Can you find them? Oh, that's gone. Can you find them? And can you find ways of releasing them to be getting on with this task? And just a few things to throw in terms of things that would help them. We need to release people to look into models which aren't reliant on inviting people to come to us, but are releasing people to go to others. We're very good at inviting people to come to us for things, and a lot of our evangelism strategies work quite well with that. But what about the many, many people who, no matter how many times you invite them to come to us, they will never come to us? So let's get on and go to them. That says something about being incarnational, actually being prepared to go and inhabit another culture and to discern what is godly about that culture and to embrace it, and to discern what is not godly about it and resist it, but actually to be prepared to incarnate it. It says something about having those people that can respond quickly, being those little speedboats that can get out and do things quickly, but also prepared to be there for the long haul. Because with all of these changes that we've seen, people are not necessarily going to go along their journey of faith quickly. They are starting further back. And so although we need speed of response, we also need determination to stick it out. And if we don't have many responses after 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to stick it out. Because at some point we will begin to see the responses. And it says something to us about encouraging those with the imagination and the creativity, which I've said already, just finding those people and not marginalising them because they keep asking the awkward questions, but actually drawing them in, giving them permission and setting them free. So I'm not going to give you any models of what kinds of churches we should plant, but I would just say to you that for urban expression and the churches that we've been helping to create, it's just taken people that are prepared to take a risk, people that are prepared to find creative ways of financing themselves, either through living by faith, fundraising, by balancing some paid employment with volunteering, by working as a team to finance one another creatively, finding ways of moving into these neighbourhoods and together going on this journey of working out what it could look like in that place. And so I'd encourage you to see if, maybe there are people that you know who are these pioneers that need to be released. Maybe you need to talk to them and encourage them and give them permission. Maybe you need to point them towards leaders in your denomination. Maybe you need to hold their hands while you take them, because that could be quite a daunting task. Maybe you need to help the leaders within your networks to know how to give permission to these people and to encourage them to be released to get on with this church planting as well. But let me pause there, and it would be great just to have time to ponder some questions. So we have a hand up from the back, which means we have some questions online. Fantastic. Go ahead.
A couple of questions. How does this model of church planting compare to house church movement? That's one question. Have you had any success with the house model churches and their multiplication? And then there's a third question. This is a personal one. Is often you hear the conversation that takes place between how do you release pioneers and expect them to function and be able to do that, but yet they're always held against an understanding of what is your measurement of success. And so we build this tension into our system that's not an easy one to walk, and it traps us.
Sure. Good question. So a couple of questions there. One about kind of the relation of house churches and multiplication, and one about measuring success. Stuart, do you want to pick up on either of those?
Yeah, can do. Give you a little break. House churches. Yes, there's quite a bit of interest in the replicating, multiplying house churches in the UK. The language is often used in the UK as simple church rather than house church, although house church is familiar as well. The main group that is out there, these simple house churches, produced a report about 3 or 4 months ago, so fairly recent, strongly advocating, but very honestly saying, actually, there's very, very, very little happening so far in the UK. In other parts of the world, there seems to be explosive multiplication. So I'm off to India in about 3 weeks' time, and one of the people that I'm going to be meeting with is leading a house church planting movement. I think there are something like 1 million people now involved in this movement, and it's not been going that long. It's been an explosive movement of the planting of small, reproducible, house-based churches. I'm conscious from friends in North America that certainly something of that kind is happening in the US, less so in Canada, I think, but certainly in the US there is something of that kind happening. But I have to say across most of Western culture, it isn't. The idea is there, the advocacy is there, but we're not seeing any significant progress in that. And I think, for me, there are reasons for that. I think the model, the multiplying house church model, is designed either for the kind of rapid conversion growth that we're seeing in places like India and China, where it becomes not so much the means of producing growth, but the means of coping with it. So in a growth situation, this is a very flexible and very effective model for enabling the growth to continue and to disciple people. Or in certain parts of the US, I think there's still enough of a church to culture around that there are people close enough to Christian culture to be drawn into these kinds of movements. I think we're probably past that in the UK. Now, that isn't to say we don't value the domestic setting. Many of our open expression teams operate primarily in houses, but I don't know of anywhere in the UK that is seeing this multiplication effect using simple home churches. Maybe that will develop in the future, I don't know, but I'm not sure that it fits too easily into the particular season we're in at the moment. Do you want me to pick up the other things well, Juliet, or do you want to have a go about measurement and pioneers?
No, that's fine. I'll pick that up, Stuart. Thank you. Yeah, so I think with regards to house churches, home churches, it might be that if they are not reproducing very quickly, it might simply be about starting lots of home churches rather than expecting each of them to grow to that stage where they can reproduce themselves. The concept of small church is something quite attractive in the UK. I know it's quite countercultural here probably, but that is something that's quite attractive, and the idea of embracing small church and choosing to have lots of small churches rather than fewer large mega churches is something that's an interesting conversation back home. But I think the question of how to measure success is a really key question. It's something that I think many people involved in pioneering grapple with. I think that it's very often they are held against other church leaders in very different contexts and compared to those. So it does make it a little bit difficult, really. And I just wonder whether this is one of the things that denominations could do in order to support those pioneers, is actually to find some different criteria to help them evaluate what they are doing. So I certainly remember when we started our work in Tower Hamlets, we used to just get asked really ridiculous questions by our denominational church leaders. And I'm sure they didn't mean to make us feel bad, but whenever they visited and asked these questions, we just felt completely demoralised by the end of their time with us. You know, they thought they'd come and given us a lovely pastoral visit and encouraged us, and, you know, they'd filled in their forms and everything, and, you know, we wanted to select on because we just felt like we were so useless, and obviously that these leaders were disappointed in us, and why were we bothering? You know, it's all going to fail anyway. So, and it's just unfortunate. You know, it was to do with the way questions were phrased. It was to do with what we were being compared against, rather than being treated as a separate initiative, really. I mean, for us, the guys that have drawn alongside us and understood us the best are leaders of missionary agencies. And in fact, we just had the most wonderful visit just the other month. We took some leaders from the Baptist Missionary Society in the UK, and they came to Manchester, and I took them around to visit 4 of our teams, and they walked around the neighbourhoods, they visited some of the initiatives and places that they're involved in, and they had two interesting comments. One was they noticed the fact that they had been to visit 4 church plants and not been inside one church building. None of the activities happened within a church setting whatsoever. And the other comment they had was that if they were visiting their missionaries overseas and observing the level of incarnational engagement with these neighbourhoods, they would be so proud of their teams. That they were, you know, getting earthed in their neighbourhoods, that they had built this level of relationship, these connections with people that never set foot inside church, these people of other faiths, these people of other cultures. They would be coming back to the UK and writing it up in their magazine and saying, this team is doing a fantastic job in Bangladesh or India or Mexico, or, do you know, what a great team. And, you know, we just felt so encouraged. We thought, these guys understand that we are missionaries in our own land, but we are missionaries. And to be honest, perhaps sometimes some of the other leaders in a variety of denominations have not understood that and have just said, but you've not got a Sunday morning church gathering yet. How many members have you got? Do you know, how many baptisms have you had? How many discipleship courses have you run? How much money are you getting in? Like, just don't ask those questions. And I often felt, if someone had come to us and asked us the question, what signs of the kingdom week? Give us some examples of the signs of the kingdom that you have seen. Do you know, we could have written an essay every single week of what we had seen in God's lives. But ask us how many bums we've got on seats. You know, we wouldn't be able to respond to that and we'd feel like failures. But the kingdom of God was developing in that place. So I think there's a real challenge there for pioneers to be strong enough to cope with that. But also for our denominational leaders, please, 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 learn to ask the right questions. And if you don't know what questions to ask the pioneers to give you a list of questions that they would like to be asked whenever you meet them. You know, hold them accountable by all means. They want to be held accountable, but they want to be able to answer the questions that make sense in their context, not questions that make sense in somebody else's context, please. Another question. Kurt. Do you want to use the microphone so we can hear you?
So this is a follow-up. We talked about it. I was in class this week.
Okay.
But you're talking about mission organizations and overseas. Could the two of you maybe just kind of spell out the maybe the similarities in approach that denominations may consider in foreign and domestic mission, as opposed to the foreign mission has this set of expectations, whereas here in this local context, the expectations often seem much more rigid and kind of programmatic, and so I don't know if that makes sense. But
no, that's a great question. I'll hand over to Stuart in a moment, but my first response is that in our context back home, where post-Christendom is perhaps way more advanced than here, it's becoming increasingly illogical to have domestic and global missions separate. It's just illogical and it doesn't make sense. And those who are pioneering are feeling increasingly more comfortable with the mission societies than with the denominations. And in fact, there have been some situations, even in the Anglican Church in the UK, where the missionary society is developing training courses not only for their missionaries, but now to train leaders in the UK. And they're doing it because some of the ministerial seminaries are not adapting their courses quick enough. And so students are going to the seminaries and they are coming out of these theological colleges feeling completely ill-equipped to minister in today's context. And the missionary societies are seeing this, and they're just fed up of asking colleges to change, because they're big ocean liners and they're just taking too long. And they're doing a great job, and they're training people for ministry in established church, which we still need, and that's fantastic. That's great. But we also need to be training people to be speedboats who can zip around and measure things with different criteria. And it's just a really interesting phenomenon in the UK. It's coming out of necessity. For you guys, actually there's an opportunity to be more intentional about that and work towards that, so that perhaps it happens in a more harmonious, intentional way. Anything more about that?
So therefore I would have said something very similar. We really got to get away from this idea of home mission, overseas mission. It just doesn't make any sense anymore. So I think it's really just a question of church planters learning from the experience of cross-cultural missionaries through the centuries. And it is cross-cultural mission. I think that's one thing that's worth saying, that church planting into a post-Christendom Western culture is as much cross-cultural mission as going overseas. And we need to think of those terms. So for some church planters in our own countries, it will mean learning a new language. It will mean learning a new culture. And so that takes time. We don't expect missionaries who have to learn a new language and new culture to be particularly productive in the first 5 years. Much of the first term of missionary service, 3 to 5 years, is spent simply language learning and culture learning. So that says something about time frame. So if you have a model of supporting church planters for 3 to 5 years and expecting by then they'll have planted a church and it'll be self-financing. That's really an old paradigm that isn't going to work in most places much longer. So time frame, priority, listening, learning, getting better culture, very, very standard things in cross-cultural mission. We just simply need to apply them to church planting here as well. A follow-up from that is the whole area of contextualizing the gospel. And again, that's something that missionaries have been very aware of for quite a long time now, that as you move cross-culturally, you need to find language and images, ways in which you can tell the story that makes sense in the host culture. That's something we need to apply just as much in post-Christendom, in a context where people often don't know the story, don't understand the context. We need to work pretty hard at contextualizing the gospel. But again, it takes time. You're not going into a situation with a ready-made formula, with a set of words, with tracts that you can start handing out in the streets straight away. You're going in to listen and to learn, to try to find connection points between the gospel and the cultural context in which you're operating. And I think the third thing would be to say that one of our goals with an urban expression, which we have struggled with really, but we remain committed to, is raising up Indigenous leaders who are part and parcel of the community into which the teams are sent. We recognise that in most of our teams, the people who are moving into the community aren't a natural fit. It is cross-cultural mission. They come from a different place, they come from a different background, and if the church that is being planted is really going to thrive and persist, then it really does need Indigenous leaders. And that's going to take time as well. So with the common theme running through everything I'm saying is time. It just takes a long time to plant in this sort of way. But it does mean that the intention of the team that is planting the church is either to pull out at some point in the future and leave it to Indigenous leaders, or at the very least, pull back sufficiently for Indigenous leaders to come through and to begin to take responsibility. That is not a new thing. I was a church planter in the same part of London that Juliet was, only some years earlier, late 70s and 80s. And after about 11, 12 years there, that I needed to move out, not because I wanted to, I probably thought I was going to be there forever, but in order to allow Indigenous leaders to take much more responsibility in the church. I found that a very tough decision. I loved the community there, I didn't want to go, but I thought it was essential for Indigenous leaders to take much more responsibility, and I was becoming the blockage. Now I think that's a cross-cultural mission perspective. I don't think that's a normal European church planting perspective.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Any further questions? We've got about 10 minutes before we try and wrap things up.
Very practical question. If it's not about counting the bums in the seats, and it's not about goals, and it's not about that, and I understand that, I love that. The program that I've heard about follow-up, and a new visitor comes in, and it's very important that they get contact 24 hours after they leave you, and it shouldn't be from the pastor, and there's a formula to follow. And do you, in that context where you're not necessarily counting, or do you hand out visitor cards and you get information right away? Is there a method to that, or are you just open and the people come back when they want to come back?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of our teams have developed some strategy in what they're doing. Very few of them began with a come to us kind of model, but some of them have had very clear strategies of what they are wanting to do. So one of our guys, Gary, he was he was a brilliant pastor of a church, and a brilliant church, but he became increasingly convicted that there were many more people that would never set foot inside a church. So his heart really was just brimming over for those very unchurched people. He moved to Manchester with his wife, and there was no money to fund him. Baptist Union had no money to pay him. He's a Baptist minister. So he decided, stuff it, I'll go anyway. I'll find some work. So they moved to Manchester. He took on 2 minimum wage jobs, one in Blockbuster video rental, which is great because he just got to know so many people. And the other job was in an Asda Walmart store, so a big supermarket store, 300 staff who he just began to get to know as well. He also registered with the local funeral undertakers to take funeral services. He said that he would take any funeral as long as people weren't looking for a Christian service. So if they wanted a Christian service, they'd go to the local clergy who would be available to do that. So he wanted to do either non-Christian or those who were looking for humanist funeral services. And he discovered that actually most people who want a humanist funeral service for their loved one don't actually want no mention of God. They just want a funeral service that says something about the person who's died as much as is said about God. So it's really interesting. Anyway, so he meets, by working these 2 minimum wage jobs, he meets literally hundreds of people. He ends up, because he's that kind of social person, he ends up running all these social events for all the staff at Walmart. Paintballing groups, go-karting groups, trips to the cinema. He goes around the store with a little book in his pocket because constantly, wherever he is in the store, someone stops him and says, Gary, here's my phone. Put me down. He's like, yeah. And then someone else comes up to him, Gary, here's £5. So he's just going around, and he's, in effect, the chaplain to this store. No, but he is. So anyway, in his strategy, with those people whose funerals, the family of the people whose funerals he's doing, he has a strategy that he's going to take the funerals, he's going to give them quality time as he prepares for the funeral, and then after the funeral he's going to offer bereavement counselling courses. So he sets up this 5-week course. And when he's done a certain number of funerals, he invites people, says, do you want to come on this bereavement counselling course? And everybody wants to come on it. So it's just great. His next stage of the strategy is that he will set up a course, something to do with spirituality. So he waits till he's done several of these funerals, and then he starts to ring round the people who've been on the bereavement course, thinking, I maybe have to ring around 25 people to see if maybe 4 or 5 are interested in this spirituality course. Because, I'm not going to do a hard sell on them, it's completely voluntary, but I suspect some of them might be interested in spiritual things because someone's died. So he rings up the first 5 people, every single one of them wants to come on a course about spirituality. And so, he has this course. So for him, there's very clear ways of measuring whether he's having an impact on people's lives and whether God is connecting with people. Questions like, how many people in your neighbourhood have you got to know? I mean, that would be a great question to ask a new minister of a church. Not how many people have you got to know in your church congregation, but how many people in your neighbourhood do you know? How many times have you been invited round for dinner? How many times have you been invited out for a drink at the pub? How many times have you connected with people? Just that I think criteria like that, I think say something about your community engagement rather than simply measuring traditional church criteria. Do you see what I mean? So I think measuring is good, and I think, by all means write questionnaires, but have questions that are much more missional in terms of what you're measuring, actually, for those that are starting a long way away from church. I don't know if that helps. Stuart, do you want to add anything to that? Are you listening?
No, not particularly. I think that's fine.
That's all right. Get on with your emails. That's fine.
Thank you. Well,
Okay.
It's gone midnight, so...
Okay, we're near the end now. We've got one more question. I would have to say it is nearly midnight for Stuart at home, so he's trying to keep himself awake, which is great. One question from those online, and then perhaps we'll begin to draw it to a close.
From our online participants. One question is, what is the minimum requirement for a person to plant a church? And then there's another question here too, if we could put this in, is how has the celebrative type of worship, worship and praise, played an important role in church plant growth? So what are the minimum requirements? In other words, what are these pioneers? Who are they? How do we find them? And uncover them in our midst. And then how does worship, praise play into a church plant?
Stuart, what are the minimum requirements for a church planter then?
Yeah, try to keep me
It
awake.
must be in your book somewhere.
Yeah, it is. I can simply refer people to a chapter of the book if they're interested. It's a tricky one, this, because different denominations have done a fair bit of research trying to isolate the minimum requirements or the key components. And it's awfully tricky to find anything that really is applicable to all situations. So very often there are cultural elements involved. Sometimes there are theological elements involved. Some people put the emphasis much more on spirituality, some on personality, some on experience. And of course it depends very much on the kind of church planting that you're involved in. So if you're starting from scratch with a small team, that's a very different kind of situation from working with a group of 50 to 100 people who are going to be starting a congregation very much as stage one. Different again from the approach to church planting, which is looking at developing perhaps a multi-congregational model, or working with a mixture of something that's new and something that's old. There's a range of different models, and therefore different skill sets are needed by pioneers. So I struggle to answer this question concisely. I do think it's important for us to ask questions about stability, and that we need people who are at least relatively stable, who are not going to fly off in strange directions very quickly. And that means probably some kind of track record. So you're able to look at what they've done, what they're doing, and see a degree of stability and experience within that. That doesn't necessarily mean lots of experience. It doesn't necessarily mean 30 years of ministry before you start thinking about planting a church. But some degree of confidence that this is a person who will stick at things. I think it needs to be someone, and going back to what Juliet was saying earlier, who can think outside the box. Someone who isn't simply hidebound by the traditions or by the models they're familiar with. We don't want someone who is simply going to apply whatever the latest textbook on church planting they've read is, even if it's one that I've written. What we need is people who will think outside the box, who will think creatively, who will think contextually, take time to listen to their community and so on. So those would be the kinds of things that I'd be looking for. Most of the research turns up things like prayerful, reads the Bible a lot, that kind of thing. Well, I have no problem with that, but that doesn't seem to me to be focused enough in terms of what we're looking for in the church planter. If there are clearly character issues and spirituality issues that do need to be taken into account, but I think when we're looking for church planters and pioneers, we perhaps want to focus on what is it that makes someone a pioneer rather than a pastor, or a church planting team member rather than a member of an existing church. And that's where it becomes a little bit more difficult to tie down. So sorry I can't be more helpful on that.
Oh, that sounds great. That sounds brilliant. I think the question about celebratory worship, maybe I might just respond on chat to that. Is that okay? Because it's 4 o'clock. Close. So Jeff, shall I hand over to you?
It's been a great day of learning. Stuart, thank you for spending time with us watching the West Ham game on that other screen that you've got there. Did they win? Oh. We know it's midnight there. Thanks for your willingness to stay up with us and be a part of this learning community here and in other places across the country. Juliet, thank you for making it into the country, and for whatever lie you told at the border to get in. Stuart, next time you're coming to Disneyland, okay? And for being with us today to teach us and to lead us in this. I think sometimes our language is confused. When we talk about church planting, we end up thinking replicating the institutions we've known. Maybe the language that we need to begin to adopt is we plant the gospel, because the fruit of the gospel is the church. Wherever we plant gospel, wherever we plant that victory news that Christ is Lord, the church emerges from that. It may not look like church as we know it in where the places we practice it, but church emerges from that. So may we go from here as gospel planters and as leaders of gospel planters to see God's kingdom furthered so that the world as it is becomes the world God intends it to be. Thanks again for your time. Thanks to all of you online. It's been a great day. We've appreciated your input here, and we look forward to more conversations like this in the future. God bless. Let's pray together, and we'll be adjourned. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the way you have taught us. We thank you that your Spirit's been present, stirring our hearts and imaginations about what could be and about what already is beginning to emerge. Thank you for Urban Expression in the UK, for Stuart and Juliet and Jim and all the teams across Great Britain. Lord, would you continue to bless that work in the way that you have, not with great numbers and with flash and glossy 8x10 stuff, but with the humility and the creativity and the relationships that you've granted them so far. Continue to knit our hearts together across the Atlantic so that we who are bearers of the Anabaptist tradition here can walk with our brothers and sisters who are discovering the Anabaptist tradition there. Make us one, we pray, Lord. Send us out now with your grace and your blessing. Lead us and guide us as we seek to be your people.